Greetings, ladies and gents, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called Never Hire Human Mercenaries, written by Atra55. When Duchess in Dover discovered the humans, she was ecstatic. After the initial misunderstandings, she realized that mankind was the tool she needed to take the throne. There were only about 12 billion of them, with only one real system. They would be easy to control. More importantly, they were good at fighting. Well, they were for the most part terrible with sword, spear, and bare hands, but they didn't need that. They had evolved to be able to throw things with deadly accuracy, and as such were great at distance attacks. Nowadays, they didn't rely on throwing stones, but rather what could only be described as portable artillery. A well-armed and well-trained human could take out dozens of enemies without getting hurt. Not only that, they were great at tactics too, using snipers to disrupt the chain of command, forcing the enemy to fight them in disadvantageous terrain, making a show of their power to push the enemy to surrender, destroy supply lines. The more Duchess in Dover learned about the humans and their military history, the more she was convinced that she needed to obtain their strength. But she would need to act carefully. Even if humans were primitives, they were still more numerous than her subjects, and she had learned many reasons why an invasion would go wrong. No, she needed another way to convince them. So she would offer them to fight for her in exchange for technologies, rare minerals, and land. Tech and minerals would make them even stronger, and the land they'd be interested in would be around their home system. That is to say, utterly worthless. It was perfect. And after a few months of deliberation from their citizenry, she still didn't understand the point of the system, but she was ready to ignore their eccentricities as long as they fought for her. They accepted. After that, she just had to wait for a good opportunity to strike and unleash her new mercenaries. While they were ineffective in space, they worked wonders on the ground, even better than anticipated. They were so terrifying that many nobles joined in Dover's faction just to avoid facing them. And they only grew stronger every time they got their hands on a new technology. Soon, they were no longer asking for payment, just the right to reverse engineer things they looted from planets they invaded. They then used it to improve not only their weaponry, but also their augments, a technique so insane Uzar's scientists never even considered it. Humans were putting technological implants in their bodies to become stronger, faster, and more accurate. The translated chip was also an example of that. Soon they began to develop their own fleet, not build it, however. In fact, to make use of their ground combat superiority, they adopted boarding tactics, with the added bonus of getting to keep the ship. Once they had enough ships to transport large amounts of people and materials, they began handling their prisoners themselves, which was a relief for the Duchess, as keeping what was quickly amounting to hundreds of millions of civilians and soldiers was becoming a logistical nightmare. The humans were bringing their prisoners back to their territory, where no one really knew what happened. When asked, their ambassador simply replied that they were used to expand their economy. Dover knew enough about human history to understand what that meant. The humans even accepted prisoners from other members of the coalition as payment. Dover did feel a bit bad sending even the children in what was probably slavery, but she needed to pay the bills somehow, and the massive amounts of rare metal the humans demanded was simply not sustainable. By the time the usurper fell, nearly 3 billion Uzans had been sent to the humans. They were viewed by most of the Empire in a mixed way. On one hand, they were absolutely terrifying warriors. They had only sent 10 million soldiers at the max, and yet no one contested that they did most of the work to bring the Empire down. On the other hand, they always sent help to the planet they captured. They built hospitals, helped to feed the population, and generally acted very differently towards their enemy, or those they viewed as innocents. This led to an interesting situation, where the planets who were the most scared of humans were those where they had never set foot. But the war was over, and its horrors behind them. Now it was time to celebrate the coronation of the new empress, with an entire month of festivities. Dover tried to enjoy it and a new position, but she couldn't but worry about her debt. The humans had become more and more expensive during the war, and she had accumulated a considerable debt to them. As Empress, she could technically declare that the debt didn't exist, but that didn't seem like the wisest move. The human General Secretary, which, as far as she understood, was their leader, requested an audience as soon as the coronation was over. The imperial coffers were empty, as both sides had spent everything in the war. She decided to wait 1 year before paying, then another, and another. After 4 years, the debt had increased significantly, both from her using humans to put down many rebellious fractions and their significant interest rates. The General Secretary requested an audience. It was denied. He still came, and the Empress had no choice but to organize one. She now understood painfully that even an absolute monarch does not hold absolute power. He bowed down, as low as it was expected for a commoner meeting the Empress before speaking. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid the issue of your debt towards my nation cannot wait a single day longer. As much as it pains me to say, and rest assured, I don't mean any disrespect, you can't pay us in money or metals anymore. You need to take a decision. And what do you want? Technology? Land? I'm afraid you no longer have technology, we don't. As for land, we are not interested in imperial territory, and our law recognizes what's beyond that as up for grabs. We accepted you giving territories you didn't have before, but now that is out of the question. Then what? I'm afraid that you can only pay us in power, and don't bother trying to delay the payment. Our army is already in position, and ready to assist the revolutionaries we swayed to our cause. Who's our citizen of the United Nations will come back to the Empire and help it transition to a constitutional monarchy." "Who's our citizen? Who are you talking about?" she said, already given up the idea of stopping the humans years ago. If she was honest with herself, she had known that it would end like this since years. "Well, we saved many poor souls from the imperial judiciary system during the war. Curiously, nobody in the nobility seemed to care about what happened to them. A perfect opportunity to show them how we run things and prepare them for the inevitable day of the confrontation." End of story. Story number 2. There is a Reason, written by zalurker. Jump point forming. Where? Have the scouts report. Outer fleets unite, prepare for engagement. No, sir. Jump point forming in front of us. In a saddle point. Bogey is quite large too, estimated size of a carrier. The Admiral looked over at his second-in-command. "That's impossible. You can't de-jump into a Lagrange point. Even jumping out of one is the last resort." The main fleet was busy resupplying at the Lagrange point, or saddle point just for such a reason. Spacefault drives could not be activated in a star's gravity well. Standard practice was to fly out with a conventional drive until gravitational interference was small enough to allow a stable jump. It was possible, albeit very risky, to attempt to jump from a Lagrange point where the star's gravitational pull was cancelled out by the mass of the significantly sized gas giant. Such a point also made for good station keeping during a resupply of fleet units, which is why the fleet was currently using one as a staging area for the next strike into Terran space. Their fleet was in shambles and they were trying to evacuate their outer colonies. But no one tried to jump into a saddle point. The chance of a spacefold collapsing on a mass of the ship was too high and would be catastrophic to it and the surrounding space. "All ships, shields up and emergency burn away from the jump point. Now, expedite, expedite!" "Sir." "Veer away from the point. We need to get as much mass between us and it. We are under attack." The tactical was showing chaos. The destroyer had just collided with the resupply carrier, but the smaller frigates were turning and prepping combat burns. But most larger ships were still powering up shields and attempting to turn away from the jump that was now visible as a strange blue glow. But it was too late. "Brace!" The Terran ship was trying to tear a hole in space and force its way through. But unlike a normal stable jump, space was fighting back. There was no way its drives could handle the load. The nose was visible, but flat-faced, unlike the standard Terran warship prow. One of their large ore carriers. Telemetry showed what looked like a full load. Suddenly, the screen flashed. Tactical froze and the bridge went dark. He could hear the screaming from the augmented crew who had not disconnected in time. It sounded like feedback from an old microphone. "Status!" Then the shockwave hit. The inertial dampeners finally failed, and he was thrown into a bank, feeling something crack. The ore carrier's drives had failed, the artificial wormhole collapsing on the ship. Almost half of its mass was caught in the fail and converted into a hard radiation that hit the forward section. The bow and the cargo vaporized into fast-moving waves, sweeping out in all directions. To any observer, it would have looked like a neutron star burst. The fleet was hit by a fast-moving cloud of ionized atoms and hard radiation. Shields failed, drives and hulls melted, smaller ships were completely vaporized, adding to the cloud. Inside the larger ships, the dampers failed, and the internal temperature skyrocketed, making any organics alive and setting off secondary explosions. The ones that had been able to turn away in time and offer the smallest silhouette were the luckiest. The stern and all the drive mass took the brunt of the blast, large components melting and buckling. The Admiral groaned. He was drifting in darkness, one hand instinctively gripping a rail. Artificial gravity had failed, mercifully, as he could feel bones grating as he moved one leg. Around him, he could hear faint groaning and muffled cries. The acrid smell of blood filled the air. He coughed, feeling something great. "Status report." "Restoring backup power now, sir." Emergency lights flickered on, and a faint whine could be heard. Around him, screens flickered on, a lot of them showing red. Too much red. "Tactical." "Working on it." In the center of the bridge, the holodisplay flickered to life and booted through its sequence. A floating body warping one side. It was his second in command. No neck should bend like that. Around him he heard crew giving status reports as life came back to the bridge. Tactical blipped and showed him his fleet, or what was left of it. A few larger ships still showed active, but blinked red. A number of inert hulks were tagged as unknown. They had been lucky. A troop carrier had moved between them and the jump point, shielding them from some of the blast, but not enough. He carefully pulled himself to his chair and gripped its one arm. "Ship status." No telemetry from the drive section, multiple stress warnings from the superstructure. Emergency crews report melted bulkhead hatches and rising temperatures. They're abandoning any rescue attempts and falling back. They report banging in some sections. "We're in a slow tumble. The helm is using attitude thrusters to stabilize it, but they seem to be outgassing. Damage control working on containing it." He winced. The drive was probably gone, and the ship's back broken. Any trapped crew would die as the heat bleeds through. He brought up the ship overview. "The fleet." "Telemetry only from most ships. The ones reporting in have suffered heavy damage. We are getting back feed from the outer limits. Imagery only." Tactical was replaced by a live feed from a nearby picket ship. It showed the flash in the center of the screen, and then a wave rolling outwards, slamming into larger vessels and vaporizing smaller ones. A resupply ship, turning to burn off the ecliptic, suddenly had its drive wink out as a blast wave hit it. The chaos in a multispectral and false color was horrifying. As he watched, the approaching wave hit and the display cut out. "Ship reports damage, but nothing they can't handle. The blast wave is dissipating fast, but the radiation pulse will wipe out any unshielded life forms in the inner system. Nearby units moving to render assistance." It was a good thing this was an unsettled system. He winced, partly from the medic injecting painkillers, and partly from the mental image of this happening in a colonized system. "Contact, jump points forming, multiple jump points being reported by the outer fleet." Tactical zoomed out, and he could see the distinctive Terran drive signatures, more than the outer fleet could handle. "We have an open radio channel from one jump point." "Put it on." A woman's clipped voice. "We came to you with open arms. We told you of our rules of war. You ignored all of it. There is a reason why we had them. Outer units prepare for engagement. Any active ships to burn out and engage. Jump point forming, another one in the saddle point. Brace!" He looked at the young medic next to him. "I'm sorry." The ship slammed sideways. End of story. I would like to thank our T5 members and patrons, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Vidmori, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.